Hi, I'm Stanley Goldberg, host of the Inquiring Mind podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you're new here, I release 2 episodes a week with a variety of fascinating guests, and I would appreciate if you would support my podcast by liking this video and subscribing down below. Thank you for your support, and now to today's guest. Dara Horn, welcome to the Inquiring Mind podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. I read your book. It took me a few days to read it. I read it I think last week. Very provocative title. People love dead Jews. Sorry, my light. Um, Let me just start off by referencing another interview that I watched with you. And you mentioned that people love to tell stories about dead Jews to make themselves feel better. Uh, that line hit me very hard, and I think I grappled with that line because I want to believe that's not true, but I also can't help to think that maybe it is true. So can you elaborate on that point?
Well, your discomfort with the title is entirely intentional on my part. And I think that your discomfort with this other idea is probably related to your discomfort with the title. What I often tell readers is like, if you feel uncomfortable with the title, you will feel even more uncomfortable with all of the material inside this book. And that is my intention as, as a writer who's been publishing books for 20 years, I've realized that the uncomfortable moments are often where the story is, because that's the place where you are not exploring something that you have been avoiding learning. And that means that when you're uncomfortable is a moment when you're about to learn something. So to your point about, this, what I often say is, that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And I think that you see that in many examples in this book. But what I mean by that is that this is used, stories about, about the murders of Jews specifically are used as a kind of a feel-good lesson, where people want to, learn something about humanity. But they do this in the process of erasing living Jews. And so when I say people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves, one example of this that I think you see everywhere is the way we have so much Holocaust memorialization. And I'm going to give an example of the way that's used in contemporary context. What we often find today is that every time there's some public figure in the United States who makes some vaguely anti-Semitic comment, and it doesn't even matter if they're on the right, on the left, wherever, or in politics and some other celebrity culture. Whenever this happens, like someone drags that person to a Holocaust museum, and then that person like gives some statement where they're like, "Wow, Nazis are bad." I mean, the thing about this is that this is cost-free for that person, right? Because it doesn't take any effort to, apparently it does take effort for some people to say that Nazis are bad, but it's not that hard to say that Nazis are bad. That's kind of a low bar. And what you also see there is that, anyone who goes to a Holocaust museum will hopefully feel bad about what happened in history, but they also will feel great about themselves because we all look great compared to Nazis. Right? Anyone who goes to Holocaust museum is like, wow, I would never do that. I'm like, yeah, you probably wouldn't, right? But like, is that really our standard here? And also, Holocaust, something that happened long ago and far away, didn't affect you. And what that means when you drag that person to the Holocaust museum to have them make the statement, it means that they don't have to engage with living Jews. They don't have to engage with anything involving actual content of Jewish culture. They don't have to acknowledge any ways that anti-Semitic tropes and stereotypes are still playing a role in our current contemporary society. And they don't have to take any kind of accountability for their role in that. So that's what I mean when I say, people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves. And in the book, I have many different examples of this, many of which have nothing to do with the Holocaust. For example, I have examples of this in places around the world where you have many different cities and countries where there used to be large Jewish communities and now there are no Jews anymore, for reasons that are often left unstated. And what you find in those places is this like tourist industry of what's called Jewish heritage sites. And as I put it in the book, Jewish heritage sites is a brilliant marketing term because it sounds so much better than property seized from dead or expelled Jews, right? Like, who wants to go to that? So, that's sort of another example of these, societies. This often happens more overseas than here. Societies that tell this story that, it's like, look how glorious we were in the past, or something like that, or look how wonderful we are now in memorializing this community, without taking any kind of responsibility for perhaps that society's role in driving out that community. So I've been talking for a while, I should stop, but there's a lot of, there are many other examples in the book of this kind of dynamic going on. And as you say, it's uncomfortable, and you don't want to believe it, but the fact that you don't want to believe it doesn't mean that it's not there.
Right. And I think before we get into the contents of your book, I think I remember, I don't know if it was last year or 2 years ago, there was a case with a famous, I don't even know who he is, like a TV personality, I guess, Nick Cannon. He was married to Mariah Carey. He said something about what people, I don't think it was perceived. I think it was actually an anti-Semitic statement on his like radio show. And I think he then went on to post on Twitter that he read Barry Weiss's book about anti-Semitism. Okay, like, he did work. He read a book, which is great. But I think we focus a lot on these celebrity cases that are clearly kind of, some people can be anti-Semitic and they say anti-Semitic things, and then they get taken to a Holocaust museum. But how about for just an average person, that if you want to convince, it sounds weird, you have to convince them not to be prejudiced towards a group of people, and you don't want to drag them to a Holocaust museum because, that's a very, low bar that you're holding them to, like, oh, everything else is not the Holocaust, right? But what do you do? Where do you take them? What do you teach them? Do you send them to Williamsburg in New York City or Borough Park and be like, engage with the community? Like, what do you do?
I mean, so this is sort of the larger question, is what do you do instead? Like, yeah, how about engaging with living Jews? My favorite example of this is this young man named Derek Black. This happened, I think it was like, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago at this point. This was like, he was a son of some, like, white supremacist, Nazi American, shock jock type person. And, he was also involved in this, like, whatever white nationalist movement. And but he was a young man. He was going to college, and he went to college somewhere in Florida, where, like, people on the campus like knew who he was, and Jewish students on this campus knew who he was. And rather than just avoiding this guy, they invited him to Shabbat dinner. And then they just kept inviting him to Shabbat dinner. And apparently he, like, befriended these people. He, like, wrote a book about it. He, like, denounced, white nationalism. So, I mean, is that going to happen to everybody? No. But I think that's a sort of, like, I mean, nobody tried to drag him to a Holocaust museum. And I thought that was sort of an interesting model. I also think that, there's something larger that's happening with education. And I want to go back to what you said about, like, how do we teach people not to be bigoted? I think there's a flaw in the way that we have been trying to sort of teach people anti-bigotry in this country, which is that we often have this approach where we sort of say, like, oh, see this, group of people who you might be bigoted against, you shouldn't hate those people because they're just like you and me. They're just like everybody else. And of course, the problem with that approach is that Jews spent 3,000 years not being like everybody else.
Well, you
right?
could say,
Like,
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but isn't that the case for a lot of communities? Yes, obviously Jews have been discriminated against for centuries, but you could go down the list of African Americans, Native Americans,
of course,
or all of these
yes, this is
subgroups have
true.
been
Yes,
prejudiced.
this is a flaw. Absolutely, this is a flaw in the way we think about diversity in this country. Like, for many different groups. I mean, like, for everybody. Like, why are we teaching kids, like, oh, you should, like, all those people, people who aren't, who maybe don't look like you, or you have some other, who have some other difference from you. Oh, they're just like you, and that's why you shouldn't hate them. It's like, are we really creating this standard where, in order to not hate someone, they have to be just like you? Right? I mean, this is like this, like, kind of siloing idea, or like, are we creating this idea of diversity, which is that, like, we have a lot of people from a lot of different backgrounds who all think the same way.
Mm.
Is that really what we're trying to teach people? Like, no, we should be like sort of embracing curiosity about other people's experiences, right? I mean, and curiosity about learning about different cultures, different, ways of being in the world. And, that's what, and I think that that's where you see the flaw, because that's where you see this more insidious form of anti-Semitism, which is very much flourishing in this country, which is that it's like, you're allowed to be Jewish in public up to a point, right? And that is something that I explore more deeply in the book. You mentioned like, oh, should we just like take these people to like, Williamsburg or some other like, very, Hasidic community? I mean, I don't know, maybe, because I will tell you that one of the things I write about at the end of the book is the attacks on the Hasidic community that happened just before the pandemic. And I don't know if you want me to get into this now or if we want to take this conversation another direction, but what I wrote about is that in those attacks, which, as I said, happened just before the pandemic, there unfortunately have been many since then. What I did was I looked through the media coverage of those attacks, and I almost couldn't find a news item or a news article about those attacks that didn't say something derogatory about the community being attacked in the process of reporting the article. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how much detail we want to go into. I can sort of give examples of that from those incidents. So for example, there was an attack at the end of 2019 in Jersey City. It was an attack on a kosher grocery store in the Satmar Hasidic community there. I live in New Jersey. This is actually quite close to where I live. And I almost couldn't, and this was like a lethal attack where people were murdered. I almost couldn't find a news story that didn't say something about how this Hasidic community was gentrifying a minority neighborhood, right? Which is interesting for a lot of reasons. The main one of which is there this murderous rage against gentrification where, people are walking into Blue Bottle coffee and like blowing away white hipsters? Because like, I haven't seen that happen. Why are we pretending that this is about gentrification? Yeah. Right? Or like the same thing you see in, there was an attack also at the end of 2019 in Muncie, New York, which is a community in upstate New York with a huge Hasidic population. And this is like a really brutal attack where somebody walked into a crowded Hanukkah party with a 4-foot machete and was just slashing people. And the news pieces about that attack were like, oh, just for context, there was this big zoning battle between the Hasidic and non-Hasidic residents of this town. And I'm thinking, like, do we normally resolve municipal disputes with a machete? I mean, maybe today with like what's going on in school boards, but I mean, I was sort of like this, like why are these articles being written in this way? And there's a really clear answer to that, which is that they're sending a signal to the public, and the signal is that these people deserve it. Right? I mean, this is victim blaming, right? It would be like if you wrote an article about sexual assault and you're like, just for context, here's what this woman was wearing. Right. Right. I mean, it's absurd. And, it's absolutely absurd. And what's interesting to me about it is how much of those even they play into like classic anti-Semitic tropes, like, oh, these people are taking over the town council, they're manipulating power behind the scenes. It's like, this is so old. And I mean, and these are articles that are, this wasn't like in, some like fringe website. I mean, this is like, the Washington Post. Right. So, that's what I think is really, really telling. And what it shows, I think, is the limits of how we think about diversity. Right. Mm-hmm. And, how it's like, it's okay to be Jewish up to this point and then no further. Right. I mean, there's sort of like this, like, and after that, like all the old anti-Semitic stuff is totally fine. Mm-hmm. But what's, of course, obscured by these articles is that like people who attack the Hasidic community, like they aren't doing it because they disagree with Hasidic practice and beliefs. They're doing it because these people are visible. Yeah. But the end.
How much of of what you said earlier, the fact that people always are told not to discriminate against other groups because they're quote unquote just like you, how much of that is just, how about if we don't view it so literally, right? Like, not literally, we don't read into it as much as we should. Like, how much of it is just, they're human just like us, so you shouldn't hate them.
Isn't part of being human being curious?
Right.
Isn't that something we want to teach people? Isn't being human maybe learning from others?
Mm-hmm.
whose experiences are different from yours? Don't we have this vast mosaic of ways of being in the world over the course of time and space? Do we not want to teach people about that?
Mm-hmm.
This is something I talk about, not in the book, but I have also a companion podcast to the book, which is called Adventures with Dead Jews, because the world's love of dead Jews is far too vast to fit in one book. And in the opening episode of that podcast, I talk about the Holocaust Museum in Washington, and I talk about their children's exhibit at that museum, which is like this exhibit called Daniel's Story, where like you walk through a house of like this boy who's like, you know, a German Jewish kid in Frankfurt. And like, you know, you go through his house and you see like his soccer trophies on his shelf, and you see like his teddy bear on his bed, and you see, you know, oh, his father was a war veteran, so you see like his dad's war medals, right? And then, you know, after that you leave you go to the ghetto or whatever. What I thought was like sort of really interesting about that exhibit is why is the museum has chosen somebody who is like a German speaking soccer playing kid as their representative of like Jewish children who died in the Holocaust. And the reason I think this is interesting is, in other words, they chose somebody who's like most similar to an American child. But what they've done in the process is erased the actual culture that was destroyed in the Holocaust, which was, I mean, 85% of the people who were murdered in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers. An enormous number of them were religious Jews. Like, why do we have this kid's soccer trophies on the shelf? Why don't we have his copies of the Talmud? Or why don't we have his uniform from his Zionist scouting club, right? Why do we have dad's war medals? Why don't we have, you know, dad's tallis, right? Or dad's, you know, tickets to the Yiddish theater, right? I mean, that's the culture that was actually destroyed. Like, you no longer can get tickets to the Yiddish theater. I mean, maybe in New York, like once in a while, but like, you know what I'm saying? Like, that's like what was really destroyed in Eastern Europe. And, you know, in general, in the Holocaust, that is the, you know, the huge civilizational loss. We've erased that completely. Like, we're not even teaching people about that, right? I mean, that's like the real loss. I mean, I have a PhD in Yiddish literature. People don't even know what they don't know about this culture. Well, I mean, and that sort of, to me, is the really tragic loss. It's not like, oh, here's yet another kid who played on the soccer team. Like, you know, there's not like a civilizational loss of kids who played on a soccer team. Like, we still have a lot of kids who play on the soccer team. Yes. Like many people play on the soccer team. Yeah. So, you know, that's sort of what I think is like, that's the loss, is this erasure. And I mean, I don't know how much you want me to say about this, but like, I think that there's a whole way that you could sort of reconfigure and I think that it's an action, I think it's active erasure. In other words, I don't think it's just like a kind-hearted attempt to like help people to relate to each other. I think there's an active erasure of Jewish culture that also is a legacy of Christianity and Islam and supersessionism. Because, you know, Jewish culture is the foundation of Western civilization. This isn't like some obscure little thing, right? I mean, this is foundational to the history of the West, and it has been erased deliberately. And there's more we could say about that. I don't know if you want to take it in that direction.
Well, so two things. I want to discuss the erasure of kind of Jewish culture, that has been so seminal to Western civilization. But then the other part, when you're talking about the exhibit in, where's the exhibit?
Oh, that it's in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum.
Oh, in DC, right? Yes. So that reminds me of the chapter that you wrote about Anne Frank, right? Mm-hmm. So
yes,
to a lot of people, Anne Frank is this almost cultural hero, and I think because she appeals to our better angels. That's how I would probably phrase it, because I forget the line in the book exactly, but she ends her book by saying that people are essentially, you know, good, and we should see good in the world. But the interesting part about that whole part of your book, you brought, that chapter, you brought up a character. I didn't know who he was. As the point, that's the point. Zalman Gradowski, who is a Polish Hasidic Jew. Am I correct?
Yeah, he's a Yiddish. Yes, he's a Yiddish writer. And very similar story too.
Right, but he wrote. He wrote this diary at the actual concentration camp as he was putting Jewish bodies into an oven or just like packing. And nobody knows who this guy is, but everyone knows Anne Frank. Jewish, not Jewish, everyone knows Anne Frank. Everybody has read the diary of Anne Frank. So what does that tell us about how we teach, I guess, Jewish literature or people that write about Judaism?
I mean, well, this is not Jewish literature. I want to be
Right.
super clear, right? I mean, this is literature about the Holocaust. But to go to your point, yes, this goes exactly to what I said earlier, that people tell stories about dead Jews that make them feel better about themselves, right? Because that is exactly what has been done with the Diary of Anne Frank. So the line you're talking about this is like the most famous line from Anne Frank's diary that's like, yeah, plastered on the book jackets and it's on the walls in the museum. And it's where she says, I still believe despite everything that people are truly good at heart. And what's interesting is like, she's got lines in the diary that say things like, there's an urge in all people to murder and kill. We're not putting that on the wall. But what's really interesting about that line is that, we consider it inspiring, by which we mean it flatters us, right? Because it makes us feel forgiven for those lapses in our civilization that lead to piles of murdered girls. But, it's like, if a murdered girl said this, then, it must be true. It's like, and it's this is something that's very sort of like unspoken and deeply rooted in Christianity, that like, oh, look, this tortured, murdered Jew has offered us absolution from our sins. Right, that's what's being done with this line. It's like, oh, look, this girl has absolved us of our guilt. What's really interesting about that, though, is that the reality is so much simpler. Anne Frank wrote this line about people being truly good at heart 3 weeks before she met people who weren't. Right, 3 weeks after she writes that line, she's arrested. She's eventually deported to Auschwitz, and guess what? She met people there who weren't good at heart. Right, like, don't you think that if she survived that experience, she would have had like something more interesting to tell us about this? Yeah. So, I mean, and that's what this is sort of that's why I contrast it in the book with this diary of Zalman Grodowski, written in Yiddish. This is very similar situation, young person at Auschwitz, his diary is murdered at Auschwitz, and his diary is discovered after his death. Very similar, parallel situation, except he wrote his diary, as you say, in Auschwitz. He was a prisoner in Auschwitz where his job was, he was the part of what the Nazis called the Sonderkommando, which was his job was to escort other Jewish prisoners into the gas chambers. And then after they died in the gas chambers, take their bodies out and burn them. And he writes about this experience. And, he's not talking in his diary about how people are truly good at heart. That doesn't come up. Instead he says, and also he's not like, he doesn't do this mystical thing where he like, stares into this inferno and wonders why. He knows, he says these fires were started by the barbarians of the world who sought to, who sought to drive the darkness from their own lives with its light. So, I mean, he sort of sees like, this is where this comes from, this pathology of the perpetrators. And, and he doesn't mince words about it, and he's not cute about it. And yeah, this has not sold 30 million copies. And I don't think it's an accident. Why? Because it calls you into account. I have many examples of this in the book. I also talk about Elie Wiesel's memoir, Night, which was originally published in Yiddish under the title And the World Was Silent. And it's not just and when he wrote it in French, it was not a translation, it was an adaptation in which he shifts all of the anger in that book from, I mean, as you can tell, even just by the title, And the World Was Silent, this is a book that's bursting with anger at the nations of the world that allowed this to happen. Right? I mean, this is a political problem. But in the French version, under the tutelage of the French Catholic author François Mauriac, who also won a Nobel Prize, he shifts the whole narrative. It's the same story, but he shifts the whole onus of the story from where were the nations of the world to where was God. He turns it from a political problem to a theological problem. Because why would he do that? Well, let's think about this. He's writing in French in the 1950s. His audience of readers, potential readers, is a society of people who maybe don't want to hear about how they screwed up, right? Who wants to hear that? Better to blame God. We can all get behind blaming God, right? I mean, and I'm being glib about that, but like, I do think it was a very canny decision, right? Because like, how else are people going to read this, right? Like nobody wants to hear about how they're responsible, how they're accountable for, for their society's actions. People want to hear a story that makes them feel better about themselves. Like, yeah, we can all get behind blaming God. great. So, I mean, and you see this dynamic that happens over and over again in what's acceptable and what isn't. And what you see is like a really different pattern when you read literature written, and I wouldn't say, when I say Jewish literature, I want to be really clear. What I mean is literature in Jewish languages is addressing this problem really differently.
And how much of this do you attribute to maybe the authors trying to forgive, right? I think, you know, you're an author yourself, right? And when you write a book, I would imagine that when you live through a traumatic experience like the Holocaust, you grapple with what happened to you, and how much of it is, I'm gonna just lay it all out there and blame everybody in sight, and how much of it is like almost trying to convince yourself that you forgive these people for what they've done and trying to
I don't
move
think he was
on.
forgiving anybody. No, I don't think he was forgiving anybody. I think he was realizing this is the only way to get people to read this story. I think it's a strategic decision because in the Yiddish version of the book, he names names. He names all these Nazi leaders, men and women, and he names what their crimes were in these camps. And then he says, you know, Elsa Koch is now living her life and raising her children in Bavaria. You know, she was tried and she was given 3 months in prison, and now she's out and she's raising her children in Bavaria.
Is
Right?
this a
Like, he
published
names
version?
people.
Is this
Sorry?
is this version published somewhere?
I don't think so. I mean, it's in Yiddish.
Oh,
Not in English, not in French. Really interesting, right? I mean, like, he names names. He's like, here's a bunch of Nazis who are like, you know, now going about their lives, raising their kids. This is like, they're not even old. I mean, this is like, you know, 1956.
right.
Like, they're not old.
Same thing with
Right? I mean, like,
yeah,
this is not like, you know what I'm saying? So, like, this is like, you know, the forgive. Like, I don't think, like, you know, 1956 are people talking about that. I mean, Jews aren't.
yeah,
I mean, like, that's absurd, right?
yeah.
That is absurd. You know, I mean, this is sort of, you know, but like, I think that there was a strategic decision where it's like, you know, how can I get people to hear this? How can I get this to be covered?
And do you think it had any like real impact without
Well, I think
publishing
in the case
the
of Elie
real?
Wiesel,
Yeah.
it had an enormous impact in terms of, you know, allowing more people to write about this and seeing that there was a way to write about this where you could get non-Jewish readers to read it. Okay. But I also think for Elie Wiesel, in his case, I think he later was able, because of that success of that version of the story, he gained a platform for himself, which he did later use to advocate for the Jewish community. For example, he was a huge proponent of, you know, advocacy for Soviet Jews, you know, in the 1970s and 80s. He was like one of the first people to write about that publicly in English. You know, so that was sort of like, you know, and he was, and it was because he had this platform, right? And he was able to do that, but he had gained that platform with this kind of compromise where he had to sort of like hide this like completely legitimate political anger that he had and not express it. So, you know, that's, you know, so that's something like, I do think that had an effect for sure. But like, I think that there is even now, like you see, like, and this is something I read about in the book, is like this like flourishing of like Holocaust fiction that is almost only about non-Jewish rescuers. These are like, you know, like pop fiction from the past 20 years. It's almost exclusively in English and in other Western languages. It's almost always about non-Jewish rescuers. Non-Jewish rescuers were statistically insignificant, and they're treated as this like inspirational story. They're the opposite of inspirational because they show you what could have happened, right? Like, everybody could have become Denmark. Denmark was a country that saved its entire Jewish population. Like, France didn't become Denmark. Poland didn't become Denmark. They could have. I'm like, that's sort of what's interesting, right? It's like, and I think that the examples of these statistically insignificant stories of non-Jewish rescuers show you like what could have happened and didn't happen. And so I think that that's sort of like another distortion, which is stories that make people feel good about themselves. And I think that's also very revealing.
Are there books about the Holocaust that you view as like purely, I don't want to say honest, but that kind of put blame on people? And
I mean, honest works.
Honest works, yes. And that have sold a decent amount of copies and people would know of.
That have sold copies? I mean, I'm thinking like the most honest works I could think of are works like, this is one I talk about in the book, Chava Rosenfarb's Tree of Life, which is about, it's like a 3-volume work about the Łódź ghetto, which really captures like this actual this community that was destroyed. Like you see this like full dimensions of this community, because there's like 10 main characters. They're from all different walks of life. You have religious people, secular people, socialists, communists, like, it's like, there's like many, there's somebody who's an artist, there's somebody who's a poet, there's somebody who's an entrepreneur, industrialist, you have somebody who's like a poor shoemaker, like, there's like many different people, and she tells the stories from like all these different people's points of view. And like, it's like you're like living these people's lives. Like, it's this immersive work of fiction where you're living these people's lives. And there's no, there's nothing, it's not inspirational because it's telling you what actually happened. And that's like an astonishing, like, it is painful to read. Because like in the book, like you realize that like no one knows what you know. Like they go into this ghetto and they're like, wow, this is terrible. They don't know that there's like that's the beginning, not the end. They don't know, like when these people are deported, they don't know where they're going. So it's like, and she captures all of that. And also, I mean, it's like, it's absolutely brutal. I mean, all this kind of nonsense about like, oh, there's this banality of evil, that it's this like machine. It's like, no, these people are being like gleefully tortured. I mean, there's like one of the main characters ends up castrated. Like gleeful torture of these people, just like sexual servitude. So I mean, and that's sort of much more, realistic depiction of this, right? I mean, Salman Grudovsky's very realistic depiction of this. Avram Sutzkever is a major Yiddish poet from the Vilna ghetto. He writes about the Vilna ghetto. He testified at Nuremberg. He spent his post-war life in Israel, and was still publishing in Yiddish in Israel until his death in, I think it was 2010. He lived a long life. He writes, again, like this whole like idea of like, oh, the banality of evil, and this was just like these boring bureaucrats who were just like, moving people along some industrial murder system. Like that's not what's happening in any of these Yiddish writer stories, because they're like, just like showing you these scenes of torture and humiliation, like very explicit torture and humiliation that serves no purpose, right? I mean, they're like, Nazis like making Jews dance naked and burn Torahs and eat them, and like things like that like serve no purpose, like they're not efficient. Right? I mean, and you see this, but like, in terms of selling copies, no, nobody wants to read that. See, that's the problem. Nobody wants to read that, but that's what actually happened. You're not going to teach that in your 8th grade Holocaust curriculum in public school.
Right. When did you first kind of come across this concept that you read about, like that people love dead Jews? Did it linger for a long time? Was it something in the back of your mind? And then was there like to quote Oprah, like an aha moment where you kind of said, you know what, this is something?
I mean, yes, I spent 20 years not writing this book. Right. And what I mean by that is like, I published 5 novels before this book. They all 5 of my novels deal with Jewish history and culture. I also have a doctorate, as I mentioned, my doctorate's in Hebrew and Yiddish literature. So I've been teaching these literatures for 20 years. So these are like, throughout my work as a novelist and as a scholar of Jewish literature, like I always was pushing very hard against the idea that Jewish identity was going to be defined from the outside in. Right, like I always was promoting this idea that this was this autonomous culture, that we should be studying the content of this culture. So much so that I even used to ask my readers at public events, like, how many people here can name 3 concentration camps? And that's something that a lot of readers can do. And then I would ask those same readers, how many people here can name 3 Yiddish writers? I mean, since, as I said, like I think it's 85% of the people murdered in the Holocaust were Yiddish speakers, famously literary culture. Why do we care so much about how these people died if like we are not interested at all in how these people lived? Here's the problem. I sort of now look back at that and I sort of feel like I was kind of naive, because I didn't then really appreciate, because I had been avoiding it, this enormous role that dead Jews were playing in this non-Jewish imagination, and this sort of perverse role they were playing. And this goes back to your original question, right? Which was like, I felt uncomfortable about this. Like, I don't want to believe this. I think I was like just sort of avoiding this subject basically for 20 years, right? And very like loudly avoiding it. What happened was the aha moment, as you put it, came to me I'm sorry about my phone is ringing. The aha moment came to me in 2018 when Smithsonian Magazine approached me and they asked me to write a piece for them about our friend Anne Frank. And as you probably could already glean from this conversation, this wasn't a topic I really wanted to tackle. But as I mentioned earlier, like the uncomfortable moments are really where the story is. And I sort of thought like, well, this is interesting. Why don't I want to write about this? And that's when I remembered this news story that I had seen in 2018 about something that had happened in the Anne Frank Museum in Amsterdam, right? This is the museum, it's this office building where she and her family and other people were hiding from the Nazis. Like that building is now this blockbuster museum. You know, they get, I don't know, 2 million visitors a year. The news item I had read was about a young Jewish man who worked at that museum, and the museum would not allow him to wear his yarmulke to work, right? That's this small skull cap that Jewish men, religious Jewish men often wear. Yeah, they made him hide it under a baseball hat. And he appealed this decision to the board of the museum. The board of the museum then deliberated for 4 months and then finally relented and let him wear his yarmulke to work. And I had read that story and I just thought, you know, like 4 months, that's a really long time for the Anne Frank Museum to wonder whether or not it was a good idea to force a Jew into hiding. I'm like, I guess this is on brand for them, you know? And then I actually, in looking for that story online, I noticed like another news item that was from the previous year, 2017, about something else equally stupid and equally revealing that happened at that museum, which is that visitors noticed something weird about the audio guides, where you know, it's a big international museum. They have 15 languages or whatever, and it says like English, and then there's a British flag, and it says Francais, and there's a French flag, until you get to Hebrew. Hebrew, no flag, no flag. And I'm like, you know, these are PR mishaps, but they are not mistakes. They are not mistakes. And I thought, you know, like, and that's how I wrote that piece for Smithsonian. And the opening line of that piece is, people love dead Jews, living Jews, not so much. And I did write that piece for Smithsonian, but what happened was that piece came out like a few days before the massacre at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And so when that happened, it was like within hours of that attack that the New York Times called me and were like, you know, hey, would you like to write about dead Jews? You know, and then it was like, as I put it in the book, I became the New York Times's go-to person for the emerging literary genre of synagogue shooting op-eds. I'm like, you know, I didn't apply for this job. And I just thought, you know, this is kind of, again, like, I'm very uncomfortable with this. I'm like, I really don't want to be writing these pieces. And it's like, but then I feel like, you know, the sense of obligation, like if I don't write this, like someone's going to have to say yes to this in the next 24 hours. You know, and then it's like, I realize like they want me to, like in each of these cases, you know, they want me to say something like sad and beautiful that's going to like flatter everybody involved. And I just sort of felt like that wasn't what I wanted to say. And then I just thought, you know, I've been avoiding this problem for so long. This idea that like we're supposed to be all sad and beatific and like inspirational when we're talking about dead Jews, while simultaneously writing some story about how the Hasidim are taking over the town council or something like that. And, you know, I'm like, there's something wrong here. And that's when I realized this idea I had in my head, which is the uncomfortable moments are where the story is. And so then I'm like, I've been avoiding this for 20 years. I'm just going to dive into this. And yeah, I traveled around the world. I, you know, dove into this history. I dove into, you know, I interviewed many people, and I wrote this book, and it sort of explores this problem, which I wouldn't even really call anti-Semitism. It's something more like, you know, it's like this sort of like gaslighting that surrounds anti-Semitism in the contemporary world. And it really is about the contemporary world. It really is mostly, it's not really so much about history. It's about the way that history is reflected in the present.
I'm interested. Why did what was the justification that they gave for telling the worker to wear a baseball cap over his yarmulke? Was there any justification?
You know, the museum's, you know, is committed to neutrality. But we want all of our visitors to feel comfortable. I'm like, all of them except like religious Jews, apparently. But it is absurd. It's completely absurd.
But how can you be neutral in a place where a young Jewish girl was dragged out of her home, or not out of her home, but like out of her hiding spot for 2 years into a concentration camp? How that's probably one of the dumbest arguments I've ever heard.
Using logic. Yeah. Logic doesn't apply to stories about dead Jews. You see, the museum wanted to, you know, what their goal was to teach visitors about the Jews' humanity. The humanity of the nice Jews, right? The dead ones who did relatable things like, you know, writing diaries in Western languages and playing, I don't know, playing on the soccer team. You know, not the yucky Jews who were doing gross things like, I don't know, living in Israel or practicing practicing Judaism. Like, that's gross.
I'm curious, in your research, did you find any comparable examples to other cultures, religions, where the same thing, where people kind of they glorify this, I'm going to pick, these proper African Americans or proper uh, Muslims that speak, a certain language, but they kind of don't. They kind of gloss over like the rest of them.
I mean, look, I was writing my book about Jewish culture, so I wasn't like diving into like
Sure, sure,
9,000
sure.
other cultures I could have. But I will tell you that since this book came out, I've had I obviously have a lot of readers from
Mm.
many different backgrounds, and what I've discovered is like many readers from many different groups are reading this book and being like, this is really familiar. I mean, it's certainly like, think about like the way we talk about Native Americans. Absolutely, right? I mean, like there were points, where like can you imagine like the way we think about like, oh look, we've honored Native American heritage by like naming our football team after them. Like, really? Right? Like, like, look, we have these cigar store Indians. Like, look how we're honoring Native American heritage. It's like, no, right? This happens. This is very common to many different groups. I have to tell you, it even felt common. It felt familiar to me as from my life as a woman. Because I can tell you that, like, I mean, I've been speaking publicly about my books for and teaching and all that sort of, giving public lectures essentially for 20 years. And I can tell you that when I give a public lecture, or even, whether it's in person or, nowadays on Zoom, I can tell you that it doesn't matter how no matter how grim what I'm saying is, I know that I have to smile. Because all women know that when you speak in public, you have to smile because, you wouldn't want people to think you're aggressive. Right? I mean, this is something all women know. I mean, and it's sort of like what your role in that kind of society where, you maybe don't have as much power as everyone else is that your role is to make everybody else feel comfortable. And you are moderating your behavior so as to make other people comfortable. And that's one of the reasons why I chose the title of this book that I did, because I'm done making people feel comfortable. Because that's part of the problem. So yeah, so absolutely, there's many examples, and yeah, there is one place in the book where I talk about, and we didn't get into detail about this, but like the way Jewish history is memorialized in Harbin in China, and there was like a very like, and I don't think I used the phrase in the final book, but like there was a point where I was like, this is cigar store Indians. Right. I mean, which, this like, horrific, like we now understand is like this completely like, ridiculous racist thing, but somehow still fine to do that with Jews.
And it's more of a kind of a business venture in reality than memorializing Jews, right? It's more about like making this. I forgot what they were known for, coal or something, and it was like a dying economy, and this guy had like an idea to rebuild this town and
Yes.
invest $30 million, and then
it wasn't a guy, it was the government.
It was the government, yeah.
It was the government, yeah. So I mean, should we I can lay that out for your listeners. Yeah, so this is a chapter in the book about the city of Harbin, which is a city in China. It's in northeastern China. It's south of Siberia, north of North Korea, which is, as awesome as it sounds. This is a part of China that's traditionally known as Manchuria. What happened was that in 1896, the Russian government got a concession from the Chinese government to build an extension of the Trans-Siberian Railroad deeper into China in this area of what was traditionally called Manchuria. They needed to build an administrative center for this junction of the railroad. So like they basically needed to build a town. Mm-hmm. Manchuria at that time is like very vast, underpopulated. The problem was like they needed like experienced Russian speaking entrepreneurs to build this town for them. And the problem was like, who the heck wants to move to Manchuria? And at this point, the Russian government was like, oh, hello, Jews. Would you like to, not have to deal with anti-Semitic restrictions that the Russian Empire then had, but also not have to be a bottom feeder in a New York City sweatshop, which is like where Jews were emigrating at that time, right? Including my own ancestors. They're like, oh, great, we have a new option for you. You can move to Manchuria. And 20,000 Russian Jews moved to Manchuria and built this town from nothing and really built the whole infrastructure of this city. And then what happens is like, and this is so the early 20th century, what happens is like there's, successive regimes in this area make their lives more and more impossible, so that this city that they built, basically the last Jewish family is evacuated by the Israeli government in 1962. Today there is one Jew in this city, but nonetheless, there is the government there has decided to spend, as you said, $30 million restoring what they call Jewish heritage sites. And what's interesting about this is that they said the quiet part out loud. And what I mean by that is that the government of this city and this province in China, they held like what they called they held a conference which they called, wait for it, International Forum on Economic Cooperation between Harbin and the world's Jews. Yes, you heard that correctly. And they all gave these speeches where they talked about, all the famous Jews in world history that they so admire, like
That weren't Jews.
J.P. Morgan and Nelson Rockefeller. In case you were wondering, neither of those people were Jewish. And then, literally there's lines from where the mayor of Harbin says, the money of the world is in the pockets of the Jews. And this is a testament to the Jewish wisdom, right? And basically is saying, like, this is an economic enterprise for us where we are going to restore these Jewish heritage sites so that Jews will come to Harbin as tourists and also as investors and give us their money. So, I mean, there are many places around the world where people are doing this, but they're not quite so explicit about saying it out loud. And that's what's amazing, is how explicit this is. And I mean, as a business proposition, I don't think that they've, I don't think they've had a great return on investment in this yet. But I mean, it's sort of this absurdity where, like, you go to the city in the middle, it's a city of 16 million people in China, and everybody there is Chinese except for a few foreigners, including this one Jew who's still there, who actually has worked with the government. He's basically employed now as like the one Jew of Harbin, researching Jewish history for them and helping them to restore these Jewish sites. But like, it is absolutely that cigar store Indians. Like, you go into one of the synagogues, they turned it into a Jewish museum. And like, there's one part of that museum where you walk into a room and there's like these like life-size plaster figures where there's like a guy sitting at a desk with a typewriter. And there's a caption that says, "Real Jewish businessman in Harbin." And then it's like, you go to the next room and there's like, two like life-size plaster children playing with blocks, and it's like, "Real Jewish children in Harbin," right? I mean, it's exactly like cigar store Indians, right? I mean, and also what's really interesting is there's nothing in that museum, there's nothing in that museum that tells you anything about why this wonderful community no longer exists. Not mentioned. And what's interesting is this happens in many places in the world. Something I don't really go into in detail in the book, but is very much in this spirit, is what's happening now in Egypt, right? Egypt is a place that had an ancient Jewish community that predated Islam. I mean, this is a huge Jewish community that was over 2,000 years old. The Jewish community of Egypt was driven out of the country in the 1950s and 60s, and all their assets were seized. Today, there are, I think, about 5 Jews left in Egypt, all of whom are like extremely elderly, impoverished people. But the Egyptian government has now, same like in Harbin, spent millions and millions of dollars restoring Jewish heritage sites, restoring synagogues in Cairo and Alexandria. They're not only in it for the Jewish tourist money, they also are now advertising themselves to UNESCO to show how they celebrate their multicultural heritage in Egypt, to get support from UNESCO to be a World Heritage Site. I mean, it's funny because there are people who have read this book and have like criticized me for being like, "Oh, you're so cynical." And I'm like, I don't think I'm the cynical one here.
Yeah.
When the mayor of Harbin is like giving speeches about, how he wants the magic Jewish money, like, what I'm doing is describing to you the cynicism of others.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But
that's
also,
not coming from me.
what's interesting is we have this kind of infatuation with the last Jew in any given place. I kind of love those. I find it extremely funny. Every year or so, I find like an article. It's like the last Jew of, and fill in the blank of last, like the place. And like this past year was the last Jew in Afghanistan. I'm like, who is this guy? Or like who? Where do they? why are they there?
Okay, well, I mean, there's a few pieces to this, right? Well, and first of all, I wrote a piece for the New York Times about this,
Hmm.
about the last Jew of Afghanistan, that came out in October in the New York Times. And as you say, like, I find it kind of funny. I want you to think about why you find that funny. And again, this is me pushing you to the uncomfortable places.
I'm can I partially answer? Maybe I haven't
Sure.
thought about it enough. I find
Yeah.
it absurd. That's how like I find it funny because it's a little absurd that there constantly there are places where it's like the last Jew. There's no I've never heard of another religion. I still haven't heard of like another religion where it's like the last Christian in, name fill in the blank, or the last Muslim but I've always heard the last Jew of someplace. And it's a little absurd. And that's why I find it, I have no other reaction but to laugh because it's a little just crazy to think about.
Okay, I want to suggest that like what people often think of as this like, oh, like classic ironic Jewish humor is a mask for, it's actually a mask for rage. Because what you're actually looking at in this case is the vicious reality of the triumph of evil. Why is someone the last Jew in Afghanistan? That's a community that predates Islam.
Yeah.
That's a community that's like, 1,000 years old, that flourished for hundreds and hundreds of years.
Sure.
Why is it funny? This is what's interesting, right?
Yeah.
That's what's interesting. Like, yes, the person who was the last Jew of Afghanistan was, kind of a piece of work. Okay, fine. You know what? That kind of doesn't matter. This is about the vicious triumph this is the vicious reality of the triumph of evil. Right? Why are there all these countries where Jews lived for hundreds of years and don't live there anymore?
Mhm.
Because those societies decided that it was intolerable to live with someone who didn't agree with them. Yeah, that's why. And by the way, if they didn't kill them, they definitely seized their assets on the way out.
Sure.
Right? I mean, that's the amazing thing too. It's like, you go to Egypt and people today are like, oh yeah, the Jews, they just didn't want to live here anymore. They all decided to move to Israel. I'm like, that's not what happened. They
Yeah.
didn't all magically decide to move to Israel and leave all of their assets behind. Yes, they magically decide. Who wouldn't decide to do that?
If you have all these
Yeah, that's not what happened. Yes,
yeah.
this is the triumph of evil is what we're looking at.
And you find this everywhere, like
Yes.
Iranian Jews. I don't
Mhm.
think there are any Jews in Iran anymore.
There are still Jews in Iran, but it's an extremely persecuted community. What's amazing is that they are still being persecuted, and what you see is how journalists are being gaslit about it
Yeah.
because they can't talk about it. And so what happens is every 10 years, there's some Jewish journalist who goes to Iran and is set up in an interview with like 5 Jews, and that person writes, like, oh, this guy said everything is fine in Iran, so everything is fine in Iran. I'm like, dude, why did you fall for that? The only person who's written about this really well, actually, is a woman named Annika Hernroth Rothstein. She's a Swedish Jewish journalist, and she went to Iran about 10 years ago. And what's interesting is because she's a woman, she went to like the synagogues in Iran where she was seated in the women's section, and those people told her the reality.
Mhm.
Right? Whereas the men who went there were with the government minder. She had time in these women-only spaces where the government minder wasn't in the same room as her. That's really what's interesting. So yeah, there are still Jews in Iran. I mean, not very many.
Yeah.
And those who are there are not very free.
My question is, so for example, and it's almost a ridiculous question that I have to ask. For those people that still live in Iran, that they're, part of the Jewish community, I know they view it as home, but why don't they leave?
I mean, they may not have an option
Right.
at this point. Yeah, a lot of people don't necessarily have an option.
Okay.
And there aren't a few, and there aren't a ton of them. I mean, that's something I actually do write about in the book is like, for example, the community in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
Again, ancient Jewish community. I mean, that community is like 3,000 years old, or 2,500.
Yeah.
And I mean, it had synagogues that were like 2,000 or 2,500 years old. And in the book, I have a story that I heard from a photographer who went there to document Jewish sites in Damascus and Aleppo. And, she writes about how, like, she tracked down like the last Jewish business owner in Damascus. This is in 2009. So this is before the Arab Spring and before the Syrian civil war. 2009 or 10. And she, tracked down this last Jewish business owner in Damascus. I mean, this was a community of like, tens and tens of thousands of people that had been there for thousands of years. That is now all completely relocated, to mostly to Israel and the United States. And, she was like, this guy took her to like one of the last remaining synagogues in Syria. And, and she said that like, he sat down in these seats, which of course is no longer allowed to be used. And, this guy sat down in the seats his family had, prayed in for, many generations before that, and just broke down into tears. She went to another synagogue where the government minders are following her around. She had to lie to them about why she was there. Also, this synagogue, and she took tons of photographs of this synagogue in Damascus, which is a 500-year-old synagogue. I think it was just a couple of years later that it was destroyed in the Syrian civil war. So she was the last person to take pictures inside that synagogue. Mm. So, I mean, it's tragic. I mean, it's not even tragic is the wrong word, because tragic, I'm a literary person. I think of that as tragedy. You bring it on yourself, right? That's not what this is. This is a catastrophe.
Yeah.
I mean, and when you say you don't hear stories about the last Christian somewhere or the last, I mean, actually, I think there are stories like, I mean, there's the Middle East, there's many places where there's vanishing minorities.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, about like the Yazidis, right? I mean, there are many, and again, that goes back to your question of like, well, isn't this the same about the way we exploit the memories or the histories of other ethnic groups? Like, yeah, this is not an unusual story, unfortunately. What's unusual in the Jewish situation is that this culture has endured and has, been resilient and managed to survive all these many cataclysms. I mean, that's what's sort of really unique. The history of persecution, unfortunately, is not unique. What's unique is the resilience and reinvention of this culture over many thousands of years.
Yeah. To begin wrapping up, I kind of like to finish off, because conversations tend to sometimes go into a little bit, negative directions, and that's not a bad thing. I think we have to speak the truth, and it could be hurtful at times, but it is what it is. I asked 2 questions at the end of every podcast. I'll put them together. You can answer in whatever order you see fit. The first question is, if you have any, what gives you hope for the future? I phrase it that way because I don't want to be like, do you have hope for the future? I almost have to force you to have hope for the future. And the second one is, what are 5 books, fiction, nonfiction, that you would recommend to people?
That second question, I wish I had done my homework and you had told me that in advance. I didn't, so I knew I was going to be put on the spot for that. I would have come prepared with my list. I'll have to wing it. But hope for the future. I mean, you can't live your life as a Jew without hope for the future, right? I mean, that's part of being Jewish. Here's what I would say to that question is, I think that the story of Jewish history and the Jewish present is not remarkable for its litany of persecution and horror. What's remarkable about it is the litany of resilience and reinvention. And that, I think, is the story that I wish more people knew about around the world. We were speaking earlier about like, well, how would you sort of introduce this history to people or this culture to people? Would you just, have them meet living Jews, et cetera? I've often thought about the way that we teach people about Jewish culture, like even just like in a public school curriculum. Think about like, what it says in a public school textbook about Jews, right? A social studies textbook for, I don't know, middle school or high school, right? Not much, right? It probably has, if it's got ancient history in it, maybe there's a page about the Israelites. It doesn't mention that those are Jews, they might as well be dead people from a long time ago, like Phoenicians or something, and then at the end of the book, if it has modern history in it, then there's probably a chapter about the Holocaust, which is like, oh, look, Jews are people who got murdered. And that teaches us like this nice lesson about humanity. Well, like, and there's nothing in between, but like, think about what's lost in omitting that story. And this is the hopeful part. Think of what we would gain by teaching people the story in between, because Judaism is like this counterculture that runs through the whole history of the West and illustrates all the things that could be possible. And here's an example of what I mean by that. I don't talk about this in the book. I talk about it a little bit on my podcast. Think about like the way we think about literacy, for example, the history of literacy. In that same textbook, it probably tells you that until the printing press was invented, only the clergy and the nobles knew how to read, right? Poor people couldn't learn how to read until we had the printing press and, I don't know, industrial production a few centuries later. I mean, it's a nice story. It's a lie, because if you know anything about Jewish history, you know that Jewish communities all over the world had at least universal male literacy at least 1,000 years before the printing press, right? Like poor Jewish kids in rural Libya in the 7th century knew how to read, right? Poor Jewish kids in 9th century Spain knew how to read. Poor Jewish kids in 12th century Yemen knew how to read. I mean, it's like, if you taught people that story, it would reveal that like, actually, you don't need in advanced technology for there to be mass literacy, right? You just need to think that reading is important. So imagine what it would mean to, and this is where I say hopeful, think about what it took for that community to maintain mass literacy in an era before industrialization, right? Think about what that illustrates about what's possible, right? There's so many things that we think are impossible that actually aren't. It's just because we lack imagination. And what you see in Jewish history, which I find really hopeful and inspiring, is that imagination. I'm gonna leave your listeners with one more example of something that made me hopeful. This is something that happened to me about maybe about 5 years ago. I mentioned that I'm an academic. Also, I teach Hebrew and Yiddish literature. I was at a conference about 5 years ago in the United States for scholars of Hebrew. And I was at this conference, and there were a couple of people who were sitting in the back of all the sessions in this conference, just taking a lot of notes. And these people were not academics who were studying Hebrew. They were representatives of the Wampanoag Nation, which is Native Americans these were the people who actually their ancestors were the ones who encountered the Pilgrims in 1620, so in Eastern Massachusetts. They were at this Hebrew conference because, as they said, we want to know how you did it. And what I mean by that is they were trying to revive Wampanoag as a spoken language. Wampanoag has not been spoken for over 200 years. They're trying to revive Wampanoag as a spoken language. And there's only one language in the history of the world that ever has been revived from being a dead language to being a spoken language, basically history moving in reverse, and that is Hebrew, which is now the native language of 7 million people who are using this as their daily native language. After nobody spoke it for 2,000 years. Like, that took a lot of effort, right, to make that happen. And they're like, we want to know how you did it. You illustrated that this was possible. So when I say like hope for the future, like this history really illustrates like that there's so many things that like officially are impossible that are completely possible, and we don't even understand how possible they are. So that gives me a lot of hope for the future. I think like you can't live your life in the Jewish community without being aware of this like constant hope and constant awareness of the possibilities for reinventing oneself. So that's what gives me hope for the future in this context. I mean, a lot of things give me hope for the future in many different contexts, but in the context of this conversation. 5 books that I would recommend. That is a tough one. I think I might have to come back to you with a list on this subject. You're saying?
No, on anything. Just if they don't even have to be your favorite books. It could be something you read recently that you would just recommend to people. 5 books.
Something I read recently that I recommend. I gotta think about this a little more. That's a tough one. You're asking this to like an author and a person who teaches literature, so that's hard. Right. I'm going to give you a couple of books that I love that are closer to like sort of my field of study, because these are books I love to teach. I'll put it that way. Okay. So one book is the Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem's stories Tevye the Dairyman, which are familiar to American audiences from their adaptation on Broadway as Fiddler on the Roof. But the reason I'm recommending it is because the original stories are really, really different from Fiddler on the Roof. Like there's a lot of stuff that got left out of the Broadway version. For example, one of Tevye's daughters drops, Muttle, Tevye's son-in-law drops dead after he leaves her with like 4 little kids, and she has to raise them alone. One of the younger daughters kills herself. That's another fun one. Golda drops dead. And that's another fun one. Another great one is the Chava is abandoned by her non-Jewish husband and returns to her family. One of the daughters marries a rich man, like her father always hoped for. And it turns out to be number 1, an emotionally abusive marriage. And number 2, he loses all his money in the stock market. And then they become like slaves in a New York City sweatshop.
So the darkest musical of all time.
Yeah, no, right, exactly. Well, I mean, that's Yiddish literature for you. But what's amazing about this book is that like, it's a story of endurance and resilience, because like Tevye like remains the same person throughout the whole book. Is this like, you see this resilience of character. His last line in that book is, he says, tell all of our your Jewish readers, and he's speaking to the writer Shalom Aleichem, tell all of our Jewish readers everywhere that our old God still lives. That's the last line of that book. And so it's like, you read that book and it's like, it's just like changes your whole opinion about like this whole like sort of stupid nostalgia you have for the Jewish past. It also sort of just like, it introduces you to a culture that you knew nothing about. It's really nothing like the Broadway version. So it's just a beautiful book. Another book that I often teach and that I absolutely love and that really influenced me as a writer is the Israeli writer A.B. Yehoshua. His book, Mr. Mani. This is a novel he published in 1989. I think it came out in English a few years later. So yeah, it's in, these are, you know, you can buy these in English. Mr. Mani is about 5 generations of a Jewish family in Jerusalem with a suicidal gene. And in each generation, there's a character who is attempting suicide. But what's interesting about this book is that it is 5 generations of this Jerusalem family, but instead of moving forward in time, it moves backwards in time. So the opening chapter takes place in what was then contemporary times. It's in Jerusalem in the 1980s. But then the previous chapter takes place in the 1940s. And the chapter before that takes place in 1918. And the chapter before that takes place in 1895. And so it's like, you know, it sort of moves backwards in time, sort of trying to sort of discover the mystery of this like recurring suicidal gene in this family. It's just like an amazing book. That was 2, but I'm taking so long with these. I don't know if you really want me to go through 5. I can keep going if you like.
You can always send me a list if you
I could say,
feel
maybe
like
I'll
something
send you a
comes to
list. I mean, I could give you my whole like curriculum that I teach in these classes. Yeah, I mean, there's so many books that I love, but I just, oh gosh, I wish I were more prepared for this question, because I'm like my brain is like going like, here's 25 books I could pick. Like, which one am I going to mention right now?
Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't, because sometimes I like the element of surprise, and I like to see what are the first books that pop into a person's mind. But sometimes, like, you know, a lot of authors especially, they struggle with it because they're like, you know, it's like picking a favorite child, or
yes, it is hard. That's exactly how yes, that is very much how I feel about it. So I'm looking around the room, because I'm like looking at my shelf. I'm like, what did I read recently that I liked? But you know, it's too hard. Okay. But those are 2 that are from my field, from Hebrew, one in Hebrew and one in Yiddish, that would maybe give your listeners something that they would never have thought to explore on their own.
Right. Well, I wanted to thank you for coming on to the podcast and for speaking with me. People should definitely read this book and grapple with it. People love dead Jews. Dara Horn, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.